Welcome, everyone, and good evening. My name is Drew Christensen. I'm a Jesuit priest, senior fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and your host for this evening and tomorrow's events. I am happy to welcome you to this lecture by our good friend, Archbishop Silvano Tomasi, with whom we've worked for many years. And it will be the keynote for our two-day program on the Pope and the Bomb. Archbishop Tomasi is a longtime friend of this university, and for several years, Pope Francis' counselor on nuclear disarmament. Archbishop Tomasi has been deeply involved in this issue since he was the Holy See permanent observer to the United Nations bodies in Geneva, which include the Commission on Disarmament. I've had the privilege of working with him on this issue since the start of the humanitarian consequences movement in 2013. Nuclear disarmament has been part of the Catholic social teaching on peace since Pope John the 23rd's 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris. Prophetically, Pope John saw abolition as the end goal of the disarmament programs. That task has taken on new urgency today because of the collapse of the existing arms control arrangements, the far greater complexity of the geostrategic environment, and the acceleration of the new nuclear arms race. Together, these developments have led to a reassessment of nuclear deterrence on moral as well as geostrategic grounds. No less a realist than Henry Kissinger has asserted that it is not possible for the United States to say nobody else can proliferate or build up nuclear arsenals while we continue to rely entirely on nuclear weapons. This fresh analysis led in 2005 to the nuclear security project of former Secretary of State George Shultz and other American statesmen, including Mr. Kissinger, calling for abolition of nuclear weapons. One of Mr. Shultz's collaborators, Ambassador James Goodby, will be with us tomorrow to discuss the latest iteration of the Shultz proposal. In 2017, analysis of the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons led to the adoption of the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons at the United Nations. And in the same year, Pope Francis condemned deterrence. In his words, the threat to use and the very possession of nuclear weapons. Last November, at the Hiroshima Peace Park, Pope Francis renewed that condemnation, saying, the use of atomic energy for the purposes of war is immoral, just as the possession of atomic weapons is immoral. We will be judged on this. The events of these 2 days, hosted by the Berkley Center, was initiated as a response to the Pope's teaching by a collaborative, including Georgetown, the University of Notre Dame, the Catholic University of America, and the Catholic Bishop's Office for International Justice and Peace. The purpose of that collaborative is to re-engage the American Catholic community in nuclear arms issues. The collaboration enjoys support from the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Other co-sponsors include the Office of the President at Georgetown University, the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, and the Keough School for Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. That's a mouthful. The Georgetown University Initiative for Catholic Social Teaching in Public Life, the Georgetown University Center for National Security, and the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, the International Federation of Catholic Universities, and the Nuclear Threat Initiative, better known around Washington as NTI. On behalf of my colleagues in the Berkley Center, I would like to express our thanks to all our co-sponsors and offer a special word of gratitude to NTI for its continuing support of our Catholic Universities initiative. Allow me now to introduce Dr. John J. DeGioia, the president of Georgetown University. To introduce this evening's lecturer, I'd like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to President DeGioia and the President's Office, especially Dr. John Borelli, for your sustained support of this work on nuclear disarmament. President DeGioia, thank you for finding the time in your busy schedule to introduce Archbishop Tomasi this evening. The floor is yours.
Great work.
Good, thank you.
Thank you very much, Drew. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to Georgetown for this special convening on nuclear disarmament and Pope Francis's vision of peace. I'd like to offer my gratitude to our partners, as Drew just described, for this convening, and to all of the individuals whose extraordinary work helped to make this gathering possible. I'd also like to welcome this afternoon Archbishop Christophe Pierre, the Papal Nuncio here in Washington, D.C., the Pope's ambassador to the United States, who has served in that role since the spring of 2016. And Archbishop, it's an honor to have you with us today, and thank you for being here. In our convening this afternoon, we're going to hear from His Excellency Archbishop Silvano Tomasi, a leader who has worked closely with Pope Francis on advancing peace and integral development. We've had the honor of welcoming Archbishop Tomasi to Georgetown in recent years to share his reflections and insights in a range of opportunities, from our dialogues on the role of our faith communities in the refugee crisis and in international migration, for a Dahlgren dialogue focused on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, for a convening around Catholic social thought, and for a conversation on his book about Vatican diplomacy, The Vatican and the Family of Nations. Archbishop Tomasi, it is a privilege to have you here with us again. Over the course of his years of leadership and diplomatic service on behalf of the Holy See, Archbishop Tomasi has demonstrated a deep commitment to human rights and to the promotion of human dignity. Ordained to the priesthood in 1965, he has served in a number of roles, including founding director of the Center for Migration Studies of New York, provincial superior of his religious congregation, Missionaries of St. Charles Scalabrinians, and as inaugural director of the Office of Pastoral Care of Migrants and Refugees of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. In 1996, he was appointed Apostolic Nuncio to Ethiopia, Eritrea, and later Djibouti, serving in the Horn of Africa until 2003, when St. John Paul II named him permanent observer of the Holy See to the United Nations and to the World Trade Organization. And later he worked with Cardinal Turkson on the Vatican's dicastery for promoting integral human development, launched 3 years ago to promote justice and peace and to address a range of global humanitarian challenges. Today, he serves as a papal advisor on nuclear weapons and disarmament and on the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. In these capacities, he continues to identify new ways for the Church to contribute to the flourishing of our global community and has strengthened its efforts to respond to the challenges of this particular time in our history. Following Archbishop Tomasi's address, we'll have the opportunity to hear perspectives from a distinguished group of leaders focused on disarmament. Joan Rolfing serves as President and Chief Operating Officer of the Nuclear Threat Initiative and was part of the original team that defined NTI's mission and scope when it was founded 20 years ago. She serves as a member of the Pentagon's Threat Reduction Advisory Committee and has previously served as Senior Advisor for National Security for the U.S. Secretary of Energy and as Director of the Department of Energy's Office of Non-Proliferation and National Security. She was awarded the Department of Defense Civilian Service Medal in 1989 for her service to our nation. Dr. James Timby serves as an Annenberg Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's been at the forefront of our country's efforts to contain and control nuclear arms, both during his 40 years of service at the U.S. Department of State, most recently as the lead U.S. expert for the Iran nuclear deal under the Obama administration. Kelsey Davenport serves as Director for Non-Proliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association and is responsible for research and analysis on the nuclear and missile programs in Iran, North Korea, India, and Pakistan. She's also the co-author of a series of reports assessing the impact of the nuclear security summits on efforts to prevent nuclear terrorism. And we're grateful to Kelsey, who will moderate our conversation following Archbishop Tomasi's address. It is wonderful to have this opportunity, to have each of you here this evening. We're grateful to you all for your work to advance our understanding of the threat of nuclear arms and for the time you will spend with us addressing the urgent moral, political, and social questions that face our nation and other countries around the world. 55 years ago, in the first address by a pope to the United Nations, in the midst of the Cold War, His Holiness Pope Paul VI spoke to the urgent need to address nuclear weapons, saying, and I quote, "Arms, and especially the terrible arms that modern science has provided, engender bad dreams, feed evil sentiments, create nightmares, hostilities, and dark resolutions, even before they cause any victims and ruins." And he continued, "The world has set out resolutely on the path toward a new history, a peaceful history, one that will be truly and fully human, the one that God promised to women and men of goodwill. It is peace, peace that has to guide the destiny of the nations of all humankind." Close quote. Well, this call for peace and nuclear disarmament is as resonant today as it was 50 years ago, and has been pushed forward in important ways by Pope Francis, most prominently in the address that Drew referred to during his visit to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in November of last year. This work to create a world, quote, "free from nuclear weapons," close quote, which Pope Francis has called for, will require our ever more globalized world to come together across different faiths, different cultures, different backgrounds, and a shared commitment to the common good. It will require diplomacy and leadership that is both moral and courageous. And I wish to thank everyone again for your presence and participation. Your commitment to engaging with this important topic is a recognition of how pressing and timely this issue remains for our international community. It's a privilege to have all of you here at Georgetown. I wish you the very best as you engage in dialogue over the course of the next day and our time ahead. And now please join me in extending a warm welcome to Archbishop Silvano Tomasi.
Dear friends, first of all, many thanks to President-Jack DeGioia and also to Father Drew Christensen for inviting me to this conference, The Pope and the Bomb, Beyond Deterrence. This conversation could not be more timely and important. We live in a moment of history when the fear about a potential global catastrophe has intensified to the point rarely experienced before. Our conversation looks at the decisions recently made by the global human family, particularly by people with political responsibility, about peace and war, a process that will have profound consequences for the future of humanity and of our planet. In his address at the Peace Memorial in Hiroshima on 24 November 2019, a place where death and life, loss and rebirth, suffering and compassion have met, Pope Francis wished once more to declare that the use of atomic energy for purposes of war is today more than ever a crime, not only against the dignity of human beings, but against any possible future for our common home. The use of atomic energy for purposes of war is immoral, just as the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral. These are the quotation from Pope Francis. By recalling these unambiguous words, let me start with a simple comment on the prophetic vision of Pope Francis. It takes strength to reject the doctrine of deterrence as the symbol of organized scientific violence, especially when the main powers of the world seem trapped in what some experts define the security dilemma. This latter term, as you know, is used in international relations to refer to a situation in which, under anarchy, action by a state intended to heighten its security, such as increasing its military strength, committing to use specific weapons, or making alliances, can lead other states to respond with similar measures, producing instead tensions that create conflict and armed races, even when neither side really desires it. With his statement, Pope Francis acted as one of the few leaders concerned with the common good in our troubled times. But political courage only represents one of the many qualities of the Pope. Another undeniable feature that people normally recognize to Francis is the pastoral guidance that he assures to the flock of believers entrusted to him. As a true pastor, he listens to the voices of his sheep. While his opposition to deterrence represents a new departure, especially from the interim ethic on nuclear deterrence accepted for a while by St. John Paul II, he, Francis, continues and develops the teaching of his predecessors with the support of the local churches, which from the very beginning of the nuclear age and year after year have appealed for peace and nuclear disarmament. Then it goes without saying that this evolution has its roots in the biblical foundation of our faith and in the long-standing tradition of the social doctrine of the Church. Our God of unconditional self-giving love calls all humanity to reject violence and killing, to return good for evil, heal divisions, respond to the cry of the poor, to respect creation, and put sacrificial love into action for a just, peaceful, and reconciled world. From this point of view, rejecting the doctrine of deterrence could be part of the new fourfold expression regarding integral conversion, as advocated by the Church in the final document of the Synod of Bishops on the Pan-Amazon region, a commitment which has to be pastoral, cultural, synodal, and ecological. For the Church, disarmament concerns find inspiration, first of all, in the Gospels, where, just to give an example, the story of Marcus is told when this servant of the high priest Caiaphas, who accompanies Judas Iscariot together with other men, when they go to arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, in all four Gospels it is reported that Peter, in an attempt to prevent the arrest of Jesus, takes out his sword and strikes Malchus, cutting off his ear. Matthew states that Peter was immediately admonished by Jesus with the famous words, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draws the sword will die by the sword." The Gospel of Luke adds that the wounded Malchus was immediately healed by Jesus. Starting from the modern era, the Holy See affirms that disarmament is an effective tool for preventing potential armed conflicts and mitigating existing ones. This is why this activity has undergone a substantial evolution, reflected in the diplomatic, humanitarian, and charitable efforts of the Church, an institution that represents a unique case in the institutional scenario of history and contemporary politics. Since the beginning of the nuclear age, the Holy See has called upon all nations on earth to renounce the possession and use of nuclear arms. Pius XII, the first pope to have witnessed the dramatic consequences of an atomic detonation, even before the explosion of the new bomb, had warned against the dangers of modern warfare. In the radio message of Christmas Eve 1941, he stated, I quote, "The disaster of a world war with its economic and social ruins and its aberrations and moral disturbances must not be allowed to be imposed for the third time on humanity." John the 23rd outlined this vision in the 1963 encyclica Pacem in Terris. He called for a suitable disarmament program with an effective system of mutual control. Moreover, as St. Paul VI noted in the 1967 encyclica Populorum Progressio, the nuclear arms race retarded the development of peoples by creating a crying disproportion between the resources in money and intelligence devoted to the service of death and the resources devoted to the service of life. He encouraged world leaders to set aside part of their military expenditure for a world fund to relieve the needs of impoverished people. Very significant are also the words of John Paul II when he visited Hiroshima on 25th February 1981. He said, "To remember the past is to commit oneself to the future. Humanity is not destined to self-destruction. Clashes of ideologies, aspirations, and needs can and must be settled and resolved by means other than war and violence. Humanity owes to itself to settle differences and conflicts by peaceful means." In turn, Pope Benedict XVI recalled that with the encyclica Populorum Progressio, affirming the concept of integral human development, the magisterium of the Church anticipates what would become an important paradigm after World War II, namely that the move from the focus on national security to global security, from the mere prevention of conflicts toward a wider peace building. The two immediate reasons of opposition on the part of the Holy See to nuclear weapons are quite evident. First, we cannot fail to be genuinely concerned with the catastrophic humanitarian and environmental effects of any employment of nuclear devices. And second, spending on nuclear weapons squanders the wealth of nations. The allocation of a big proportion of national resources on nuclear weapons could be used instead to promote peace and integral human development, as well as to fight poverty and to accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Even if these positions are obvious from many points of view, we would be wrong in considering them a purely theoretical statement. True, the world has not experienced other atomic explosions after the tragic event of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Today's situation, however, is still unacceptable because nuclear weapons tests have had severe impact on public health and the environment, also affecting cultural heritage, food security, water security, indigenous people, and local communities, and creating long-term problems such as land confiscation and population displacement. Even if not used in military operations, nuclear weapons drain the greatest wealth in the military expenses of possessing states. And this without considering that all the nuclear states are developing programs for modernization of outlawed 1980s weapons, investing massive amounts of money, an attitude that very often conceals the development of new deadly tools of mass destruction, such as tactical gravity bombs, short-range missiles, and so forth. Limiting the discussion to the US case, according to an estimate published in January 2019 by the US Congressional Budget Office, modernization and operating the US nuclear arsenal and the facilities that support it will cost around $494 billion for the period 2019-2028. This is $94 billion more than the Congressional Budget Office 2017 estimate for the period 2017-2026, in part because modernization programs continue to ramp up and cost estimates are increasing, and as a result of the nuclear posture review that calls for new nuclear weapons. The nuclear modernization and maintenance program will continue well beyond 2028, and based on the Congressional Budget Office estimate, will cost $1.2 trillion over the next 3 decades. Notably, although the Congressional Budget Office estimate accounts for inflation, other estimates forecast that the total cost will be closer to $1.7 trillion. Whatever the actual price tag will be, it is likely to increase. The Nuclear Posture Review does not acknowledge the U.S. is facing affordability issues in the modernization program, but instead labels it an affordable priority and points out that the total cost is only a small portion of the overall defense budget. In reviewing the previous reasons for rejecting deterrence, we saw that these are not purely conjectural. Rather, they have a concrete and dramatic effects on human beings, on life on the planet, and on international relations. How destabilizing is it, a nuclear test and the balance of power among nations? Devoting all these financial resources to new atomic armaments, devices, and components is leading to a new and potentially lethal arms race. The third element for the Holy See's rejection of deterrence, precisely the features of modern warfare and their impact on international relations, is maybe the most decisive argument, especially in Pope Francis' view. As mentioned, John Paul II accepted an interim ethic on nuclear deterrence. Bearing in mind the bipolar rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union, he affirmed, in current conditions, deterrence based on balance, certainly not as an end in itself, but as a step on the way toward the progressive disarmament, may still be judged morally acceptable. The frustration due to many years of failure to comply with durable and verifiable commitment with Article 6 of the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and Nuclear Disarmament led Pope Francis to make the prudential moral judgment that the strict conditions for the acceptability of deterrence are no longer being met in the current international security environment. What has changed? The non-proliferation and disarmament legal regime is weakening. Some would say disintegrating. And this is especially true in relation to nuclear weapons. As known, this is due to the fact that some of the major agreements on this subject either are not extended into force. For example, the 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or have been subjected to formal withdrawal, like the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the 1988 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Finally, will expire soon the Non-Proliferation Treaty and need to be renewed, and that is not yet certain. New means and methods of warfare are emerging, which are strategically transformative. Here my thoughts go to space and hypersonic weapons, cyber attacks, killer robots, and the more general application of artificial intelligence to modern armaments, and even to the bioengineering techniques applied to soldiers to increase their performance on the battlefield. Generally speaking, there is a low appetite on the part of states for a ban with treaties on these weapons, because many of them are already using these tools on the ground. On the contrary, for many states, the point is how to increase research and finance programs on new armaments. Then conventional weapons progressively increase their destructive character, and in any case continue to occupy the most important position in modern warfare and in its hybrid, low-intensity, asymmetrical, and interstate conflicts. Besides, excuse me, the above-mentioned development of new tactical nuclear weapons, the so-called small bomb, can make nuclear war more likely through de facto lowering the threshold between a conventional and a nuclear conflict. On international relations, a climate of fear, mistrust, and opposition is clearly prevailing, and the multilateral system is shaky. Something that, with respect to defense policy, it is showed by the constant use of aggressive rhetoric and the development of increasingly threatening military doctrines. The danger posed by non-state actors. The danger posed by non-state actors and terrorist groups is more and more concrete, especially if we think about the damage or potential uses of new and sophisticated chemical and biological weapons. All this shows the concrete risk of infringement of the nuclear taboo and led Pope Francis to state that if we also take into account the risk of an accidental detonation of these deadly instruments of mass destruction as a result of error of any kind, the threat of their use, as well as their possession, is to be firmly condemned. Therefore, Pope Francis became the first pontiff to openly reject the doctrine of deterrence, affirming that in international relations, this strategy, I quote, actually increases fear and undermines relationships of trust between peoples, and that international peace and stability cannot be based on a false sense of security and the threat of mutual destruction or total annihilation, or on simply maintaining a balance of power. The Pope does not reject deterrence in isolation, but within the context of a holistic approach that considers the nuclear questions together with military, political, diplomatic, and cultural issues. Here we can see a healthy realism of Pope Francis and the position of the Church that is neither naive nor angelic. Beyond any ethical consideration, it is at least disputable that deterrence has discouraged states not equipped with atomic weapons from entering into conflict with the states that possess them. Actually, it has even happened that the former prevailed over the latter, as shown by cases of the defeats of the United States in Vietnam and of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. In short, we cannot take it for granted, as David Barash points out, that nuclear weapons have deterred any sort of war, or that they will do so in the future. Just to remain with the case of the two superpowers, during and after the Cold War, each side engaged in conventional warfare. The Soviets, for example, in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Afghanistan, the Russians in Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, as well as Syria, and the US in Korea, Vietnam, Lebanon, Grenada, Panama, the Persian Gulf, the former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. On the other hand, criticism, even of the mere possession of nuclear weapons, and concrete evidence that deterrence does not work, do not exempt us from searching and proposing at least reasonable options for security and peace. Beyond the doctrinal efforts starting from John the 23rd, his action on the Cuban Missile Crisis, as a state actor, the Holy See has taken measures to translate its vision into action on the world stage. As a way of example, under Francis' pontificate, this policy has resulted in the support of the humanitarian initiative that on July 7, 2017 led to the approval of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, considering it a new hope to make decisive steps towards a world without nuclear weapons. Accordingly, the Holy See was the first state to become a party to this agreement, signing and ratifying it on the 21st of September 2017. Aware of the patience and sensitivity required by peace building, the peace building process through disarmament, there is no illusion that the number of weapons will disappear as if by magic or after moral and legal condemnation. Therefore, the Holy See is equally engaged in a step-by-step dialogue with nuclear armed states, whose commitment remains crucial to the achievement of any serious and realistic discussion of nuclear arms control, either bilaterally or through the reinforcement of international norms and institutions. Then the Holy See can offer neutral space for a dialogue aimed at recovering trust among nations, or advocate in multilateral fora such as the United Nations and the International Atomic Energy Agency for the establishment of a comprehensive global disarmament regime. In the long term, the goal must be to establish a durable, verifiable commitment among nuclear armed states to Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In the short term, the priority must be for the two nuclear superpowers, Russian Federation and the United States, to drastically reduce their arsenals and to limit modernization. If this goal were achieved, states with smaller but increasing nuclear forces, especially China, would be more likely, we hope, to commit to reducing and finally eliminating their own arsenals in line with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Nuclear armed states and the Non-Proliferation Treaty signatories like India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea probably would also be more inclined to accede to the treaty and to eliminate their own nuclear arsenals following major Russian and American atomic weapons reductions. During the last decades, spearheaded by civil society, the concept of humanitarian disarmament in doctrine and political practice has gradually been asserted. The international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in October 2017, is a clear example of the engagement of civil society. This award recognizes ICAN's role in shedding light on the catastrophic consequences of the use of nuclear weapons and for its huge campaign in support of the UN approval and adoption of the Nuclear Ban Treaty. Moreover, a similar vision has been offered by the UN Secretary General in 2018 in his Agenda for Disarmament, Security, Our common future. The document outlines a set of practical measures to promote disarmament in the areas of weapons of mass destruction and conventional arms, and to discourage the development of war technologies in the future, precisely to empower subjects that are normally excluded from decision-making, such as women, youth, and civil society in general. To contribute to this disarmament momentum, the Holy See proposes to frame the dialogue on disarmament within the broader context of peace building. This comprises the concept of integral disarmament, which, as explained by John the 23rd, does not only refer to state armaments, rather it calls on every person to disarm his or her own heart and to be a peacemaker everywhere. In this regard, Pope Francis never ceases to emphasize the need for accompaniment and discernment in order to explore alternative courses of action while exercising in-depth moral responsibility in order to bring peace to individuals, communities, and states. Through the promotion of human rights, integral disarmament can move us to transform a culture of injustice and violence to a culture of fraternal love that would take us beyond peace conventions and treaties to personal and communal conversion and change of heart. Integral disarmament takes us beyond the mentality of finding security only in armament and the preparation for war, and promotes a civilization of love and political friendship for the development of the whole person and of all peoples. A development that cares deeply about God's creation in its totality. In this delicate but fundamental journey, all religions can contribute an indispensable moral support, and in this way are facilitated by the fact that they are not bound by any border, and they are rooted and benefit by their long experience and history. The dialogue can also serve as an example for governments and civil society groups to build together a common future. Indeed, as has been repeated many times in language adopted by the consensus at the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review conferences, that I quote, "the total elimination of nuclear weapons is the only absolute guarantee against the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons." The greatest security benefit from nuclear disarmament is that it will not only make the use of nuclear weapons less likely, but it will make it impossible. As Pope Francis states, if we really want to build a more just and secure society, we must let the weapons fall from our hands. No one can love with offensive weapons in their hands. Our world, interconnected, not only by globalization, but by the very earth we have always shared, demands today more than ever that interests exclusive to certain groups or sectors be left to one side in order to achieve the greatness of those who struggle co-responsibly to ensure a common future. This struggle is needed and urgent. At the beginning of 2020, the current picture is one of indignation that has crystallized due to the feeling that, in the view of many, there is a lack of real effort to favor the nuclear disarmament of nuclear states, as requested by Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the ensuing discriminatory nature is becoming increasingly unbearable. On top of this comes the non-entry into force of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the absence of negotiations of a fissile material cut-off treaty, the limits of US-Russian bilateral disarmament, and the suspension of the Intermediate Range Arms Treaty, the failure of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conferences of 2005 and 2015, multilateralism, which has challenged the deadlock of the Conference on Disarmament, North Korea's attitude and that of Iran, China's breathtaking rise to power, in particular, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, while useful as a moral posture to delegitimize nuclear power and deterrence, is seen by its critics as not setting any real path, nor including any strategic consideration or any progress in verification progress. The question then emerges of what kind of post-nuclear world we want. Since we cannot disinvent the bomb, which universal watchdog would have the supervisory authority, the rights, and the means to intervene to make a cheater which would have obtained a nuclear weapon with fraud to give in? If an international order existed, in the hands of whom would it be? Time is greater than space, observed Pope Francis. A concrete historical perspective is called for in order to patiently open a path for negotiations and search for the instruments and institutions required in a world without the atomic bomb, safeguarding the stability of international relations. In this way, a new understanding of security can be accepted to protect in reality, not just in an abstract way, individuals, communities, and nations. And this may be summed up in the expression of integral disarmament. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis underlines the fact that everything is connected. Disarmament also should be approached in this vision. The question of peace is inseparable from justice. Nuclear weapons make us realize that we all live on the same planet, and therefore, again in the words of Pope Francis, peace must be built on justice, socioeconomic freedom, respect for fundamental rights, the participation of all in public affairs, and the building of trust between peoples. Thank you.
I'll hand over the podium to Kelsey Davenport, who's the moderator for the session.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight. It's my privilege to moderate the discussion portion of the event. Just to give you a run of show, we're first going to hear some formal responses from John and Jim, who have already been introduced. Then I'll ask some questions before turning it over to the audience to hear your thoughts. So Joan, we can start with you, please.
Thank you. I'm going to speak from the podium. Good evening. I want to start by thanking President DeGioia, Drew Christensen, the Berkley Center, and all the co-sponsors of tonight's event for convening this important conversation and inviting me to reflect on this challenging topic. My own convictions have developed over a lifetime of close engagement with the global nuclear deterrence system. And my remarks this afternoon are based on my more than 34 years of experience working both inside the U.S. government and in the NGO sector to reduce the risk that a nuclear weapon will ever be used again. In particular, I want to share my perspective on what is needed now to achieve essential progress on nuclear disarmament. But first, I want to underscore how much I appreciate Archbishop Tomasi's presentation. The Church's affirmation that the use, threat of use, and even possession of nuclear weapons is immoral, and its rejection of the doctrine of deterrence challenges us all to rethink our assumptions and approaches for protecting humanity. The views of the leaders of the Church expressed by the Archbishop are fully consistent with my own critique about how deterrence theory is irrelevant to many of today's threats. Designed more than 60 years ago, nuclear deterrence strategy is hopelessly outdated and is now increasing the danger it was designed to address. In how many other fields do leaders, experts, and practitioners rely on 60-year-old thinking, despite fundamental changes to the threat and technology environments? Why is this a problem? Simply put, because the world has changed significantly in 60 years. Today, the risk of nuclear use is not primarily driven by the failure to deter the intentional use of nuclear weapons. It is driven by cyber threats, new technologies, increasingly sophisticated terrorist groups, and with 9 nuclear states, a more complex global playing field. Imagine, in the midst of a crisis with Russia, if the President were to receive warning from our military that there were several hundred nuclear missiles inbound toward the United States, and under the severe time pressure of only minutes, decided to launch a retaliatory strike using U.S. nuclear weapons, only to learn a few minutes after launch that our U.S. warning systems had been spoofed by a sophisticated cyber attack. The primacy we assign to deterrence strategy compounds the very nuclear danger it was designed to address. Specifically, nuclear deterrence in its current form has been used to justify the need to reserve the right of first use. It's been used to maintain the redundancy of nuclear forces in the form of a triad that includes bombers, submarines, and land-based missiles. It's been used to keep forces in a ready-to-launch posture and to maintain enough weapons to ensure that a sustained nuclear war could be prosecuted. These practices are escalating the risk of catastrophic nuclear use. We are at a highly dangerous moment and moving in the wrong direction. This year, we mark the 75th anniversary of the creation and only use of the bomb. It's time to reinvent the way we think about nuclear risks if we are to prevent the use of nuclear weapons for another 75 years. We need a new approach to nuclear strategy, one that doesn't wager our collective future on the assumption that nuclear weapons operate in a system with rational players, perfect information, and infallible technology. We know the game theory-based deterrence model is flawed. Humans make mistakes, behave irrationally, and can receive faulty, misleading, or incomplete information. Equipment fails, and terrorists aren't deterred. New technologies like cyber weapons and hypersonic delivery systems complicate the equation further. Why has progress been so difficult to achieve? I see three principal reasons. First, as I've already described, nuclear deterrence is a self-limiting belief system. It has become a deeply entrenched dogma that is self-reinforcing within the institutions that are responsible for implementing it, preventing our ability to evolve a safer, more effective, and just security strategy. We haven't yet defined, secondly, the second reason, we haven't yet defined what should replace nuclear deterrence as a basis for our security. And finally, our strategies for bringing about steps toward disarmament haven't worked, or they've been insufficient. On this issue of strategy for advancing disarmament, in the past, the nuclear threat reduction community, including NTI, has primarily focused on influencing nuclear policy and practices through outreach to government decision makers, both military and civilian. Governments have focused on international legal arrangements. The Church has done so too, but this approach alone has proven inadequate. Indeed, the international arrangements the world created to regulate nuclear weapons are being torn down. And at the same time, citizens have become largely divorced from nuclear issues around the world. It's ironic, isn't it, that as a society we have become almost completely ignorant and voiceless about nuclear threats and nuclear justice, even as the urgency of the threats and the risks have grown. This reality has caused NTI to explore new approaches to effecting change, including through cultural shifts. What does that mean? It means building political will for change. It means building awareness of the threat and the terrible risks inherent in our nuclear weapons. It means building a new set of ethical principles to guide the strategy of the future. It's about better aligning people's understanding about nuclear weapons with the reality of the extremely high risks and unacceptable consequences of their use, instead of seeing them as artifacts of power and security. NTI has begun some initial work in this field by starting a public education program in Iowa and New Hampshire to take advantage of the presence of presidential candidates, a heavy media presence, and town hall events to do some education. As part of that work, we engaged Hart Research, a polling firm, and they found 84% of voters say it's essential or very important for presidential candidates to have plans or policies to reduce the threats related to nuclear weapons. What's more, the demand for candidates to address these threats cut across party lines, with 87% of Democrats and 81% of Republicans saying they would respond more favorably toward a candidate who put a high priority on reducing nuclear threats. That's encouraging news. One significant challenge that those of us in civil society share with you in the Church is how we translate our vision of a disarmed world into action steps. As a fellow co-struggler on the journey toward disarmament, I can see how the Catholic Church has a major capacity to shape the moral and the cultural conversation around nuclear weapons. I urge the leaders and laity of the Church to advance your message about nuclear peace and justice, about the immorality of nuclear weapons and the inadequacy of nuclear deterrence, to push out this message globally at the parish level through the pulpit. I am drawn to an image of the future in which the immorality of nuclear use and the possession are woven into the fabric of parish-level teaching, prayers, and knowledge that shape society's cultural and moral views. What if the Catholic Church truly leveraged its reach, power, and moral authority to help humanity reach its glorious potential and achieve justice for both current and future generations? The force of the Church has played such a strong and positive role in other areas, such as immigration and poverty. We are all familiar with the great work of Catholic relief services around the world. Wouldn't it be great if the Church's force could be brought to bear on nuclear disarmament? What might a Catholic disarmament service look like? Perhaps it would include great universities like Georgetown and Notre Dame deploying their capacities for research, teaching, and broader institutional agency to prevent nuclear war. You have access to a huge reservoir of expertise to support such parish initiatives. Expertise that does not exist in the hierarchy can be found readily in the pews, both within the Church itself through the expertise of your membership as well as from civil society more broadly. A parish-level peacemaking initiative that works to embody the concept of integral disarmament and to advance peacemaking in the hearts and minds of every individual in the parish would drive us a huge step forward in creating the fundamental conditions needed for policy and political change. As I mentioned at the outset, I've been committed to the field of global nuclear security for more than 3 decades, and today I am energized and enormously grateful for the Church's commitment to making a difference in this space. We at NTI, and I know the entire disarmament community, are ready to support and promote your efforts. I appreciate the invitation to join you tonight and look forward to our ongoing conversation. Thank you.
Good evening. Archbishop Tomasi spoke not only of the desired end state, peace and security without nuclear deterrence, but he also spoke of the path to get there. The Pope in Nagasaki did as well. And in particular, he called for, this is a quote, tireless work in support of agreements. He spoke of arduous yet constant effort. His use of the words tireless and arduous shows that he has some experience in international negotiations. Let me say a few words about the tireless and arduous negotiations that will be necessary to get from where we are to where we want to go. As you will see, I have views to share on this, but I'm happy to listen to others as well. The first step on the path laid out by Archbishop Tomasi would be an agreement, initially with Russia. At some point, others will need to be involved, beginning with China. But the United States and Russia have most of the nuclear weapons, and therefore will need to do most of the work, at least at first. Achieving this agreement will be difficult for at least 2 reasons. The first is the world has become very complex, as Archbishop Tomasi has said. Past agreements, SALT, START, New START, focused on limiting and reducing strategic nuclear warheads of the United States and Russia. And this bilateral, narrowly focused approach made sense when the United States and Russia had thousands of strategic nuclear warheads. Everything else seemed second order by comparison. Today, the strategic nuclear forces of the United States and Russia no longer dominate the nuclear landscape as they did when the bilateral treaties were negotiated. This is in part because of the success in reducing the strategic nuclear forces of the United States and Russia to a small fraction of their Cold War peaks. But while the US and Russian strategic forces were coming down, nuclear expansion in China, North Korea, South Asia, plus development of new technologies, including precision conventional systems, missile defenses, space, counterspace, cyber threats, have all complicated the situation and made it more dangerous. All of these need to be taken into account in a new agreement. Future agreements will be more comprehensive and more complicated to account for the more complex world we now live in. A second reason why achieving an agreement will be difficult is that both Russia and the United States will need to shift from a relationship dominated by mutual hostility and very little communication to cooperation. That's another key word the Pope used in Nagasaki, cooperation to address the existential threat to each other, even while we have major differences in other areas. Now, for the United States, this means negotiating intensively and constructively with Russia, despite Russian interference in elections, aggression in Ukraine, targeted killing in the UK, violation of the INF Treaty, unhelpful actions in Syria, Venezuela, Libya, and so forth. For Russia, it means negotiating intensively and constructively with the United States, despite the sanctions that have damaged its already weak economy. In my view, we should proceed on the basis that all the subjects Russia wants to address in a new agreement and all the subjects the United States wants to address will be subjects for negotiations. Both sides' concerns will be taken into account, at least in an initial way. This means Russia would make difficult decisions, including further reductions below the New START levels and constraints on non-strategic nuclear weapons, which they have resisted. The United States would make difficult decisions, including constraints on missile defenses and space systems, which we have traditionally resisted. To facilitate these negotiations on a new agreement, extension of the existing New START agreement would be a good idea. Extension would provide a period of predictability during the negotiations of a new agreement with a more comprehensive set of commitments. The new agreement I'm suggesting would provide for further reductions below New START levels, new constraints on INF, reduction and consolidation of non-strategic nuclear warheads, constraints on missile defense, space systems, and interference with early warning and command and control systems, and so on. You notice I say commitments. A formal treaty is not appropriate if we want to reach agreement fairly quickly on a large number of subjects, some of which are in areas where technology is rapidly advancing. So what I've just described would be a first step to resume negotiations in nuclear weapons, to begin to move in the direction outlined by Archbishop Tomasi. It would be big, it would be hard, but it would only be a first step. You will hear tomorrow from Ambassador Goodby about a joint enterprise to create conditions for further steps that will be needed to progress on the path outlined by Archbishop Tomasi. Under the joint enterprise concept, leaders of a group of nations would get together to establish a process to identify and create conditions for realizing the goal of a world where peace and security are maintained without nuclear deterrence. Chris Ford from the State Department will talk tomorrow about a U.S. initiative to create an environment for nuclear disarmament. A number of countries under U.S. leadership are working to address the obstacles to progress in disarmament and adopt a pragmatic approach that could create an environment for more and more ambitious steps in the future, and in the meantime, contribute to a constructive NPT review conference this spring. So, for those of us who resonate with what Archbishop Tomasi has said today, what can we do to support the reduction of nuclear weapons? One thing we can do is to help spread the word, to increase awareness of the dangers of the current situation. 50, 60, 70 years ago, there was great concern about nuclear weapons. Today, there's practically no discussion. But there are still thousands poised to come in our direction, one of which could do unimaginable damage. We face two existential threats to our way of life: climate change, nuclear weapons. One gets lots of attention, and rightfully so. The other, not so much. Raising the profile of this subject, increasing awareness of the danger, could contribute a lot. A second is to support those who advocate reduced reliance on nuclear weapons and concrete steps toward reductions. Tomorrow you will hear lots of ideas on how to move forward, from Jim Goodby and Chris Ford and from others. They deserve our support. The necessary agreements will be difficult to achieve. Those tireless and arduous efforts, as the Pope has said, it will only be possible if reducing nuclear danger is one of the very top few priorities of the administration and the Congress. So I'll stop there, and we can hear now what others have to say.
So thank you, Joan and Jim, for your very thoughtful comments in response to the Archbishop's remark. To get into the discussion portion, I want to dive into something that you said, Archbishop, when you talked about the importance of translating vision into action, and that's a particular priority for the Pope. And you laid out some of the areas at the state level where the Holy See has been involved in those efforts. But Joan, in her remarks, made a very compelling case for cultural shift within the broader Catholic community and the role that the Church can play in instigating those shifts. So can you say a little bit about what steps you think the Church can take to ensure that the Pope's teaching on nuclear weapons, that the Pope's rejection of nuclear deterrence, and his call to situate disarmament within the context of peace building actually is disseminated and acted upon at the local levels?
The political process is based on the vote of the elected people in a democracy, right? Mm-hmm. So we need to create a culture of peace. And the fundamental change will be to move from security based on arms and the threat of destruction of the other into a security based on the conviction that since I am friendly and I can have a dialogue with the other state, the other group, the whatever, then I can rely on this trust. This is a change of mentality before we go into technology, before we go into capacity of powerful arms or whatever. So the churches, other groups of civil society can work to educate and to help people to trust rather than to depend on force. It's a long process. It's probably a bit idealistic, given the fact that we are all selfish, but that's the change that is needed. If that comes about, then you have a base from which politicians can make decisions knowing that they have a support.
So in terms of creating that base and giving the public sort of tangible goals that they can kind of latch onto to see progress towards disarmament, which at times can seem, very vague, difficult to achieve, are there specific areas of policy, Joan, where you think the public here in the United States could gravitate towards that could help on this path towards disarmament that are more ripe now for action?
I think there are. I think one of the things that the recent polling has been showing us, though, is that the level of understanding among the general public about the nuclear threat, as Jim mentioned in his remarks, has fallen to a very low point. And so I think it's really important that the expert community help the public understand this issue at a pretty fundamental level. I think we need to start with some basic messaging that the risks of nuclear use are high and growing, and that we're not safe, and they need to ask their policymakers, what are you doing to make us safer? On my short list of things that I would prioritize for early action and that I would ask the public to become engaged on, I would say two things. First, you heard us all talk about how the existing system of regulation and constraints on nuclear weapons is disintegrating. It's imploding. We're at this incredibly dangerous moment. We have one particularly important treaty, a bilateral treaty between the US and Russia that's still in place, the New START Treaty, but as several of us mentioned, it's slated to expire next year around this time unless our two presidents extend the treaty. The treaty can be extended for 5 years, and that would buy us time to enter into a new negotiation for whatever might succeed it. So that would be my top priority, is we should all be encouraging our political leaders to extend that New START treaty. And then secondly, my other top point would be it's really important for our leaders to help maintain the norm of nuclear non-use. And for that, we should all be reaffirming the fundamental principle that Ronald Reagan and President Gorbachev agreed to in 1985, which is a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. And I think particularly as we enter into this period in the next couple of months where we have a 5-year review cycle of the fundamental treaty, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, that it would be time not just for the US and Russia to reaffirm that principle, but for all states to reaffirm that principle of nuclear non-use. So that's my short list.
Yeah.
Add something to that. As Archbishop Tomasi said, the American public is about to be asked to spend a very large amount of money on strategic modernization. And I think it would be appropriate to encourage the people in the Congress and people in the administration who are going to pursue devoting those resources to this project to, at the same time, devote equal energy and attention to the arms control and disarmament approach. There's been a long tradition in the Congress of packaging together modernization on the one hand, arms control on the other. And if there's going to be a big, future, near future request for resources on the one side, that is we should ask those people to, at the same time, give equal attention to the arms control side. And this could be a political package which could be a way to advance support for arms control in the Congress and the administration and in other countries as well.
Jim, I think that that's a really important point because often we think about nuclear weapons policy as being crafted by the executive branch, but there are areas where Congress plays a role and where voters can by virtue of voting, indicate their preferences. But given that you spent so many years in the executive branch at the State Department, given the role that you have played in thinking about how the United States approaches arms control negotiations, can you talk a little bit about how questions of morality and ethics have guided U.S. thinking in the arms control and disarmament space? And what, if any, steps you could see the church taking that could possibly be more effective in bringing those conversations to light?
These issues are traditionally approached in a pretty practical and pragmatic way without a lot of consideration to the moral and ethical dimensions that you mentioned. And I don't see that changing. I mean, traditionally, you don't see a big change in policy without some sort of crisis, without something bad happening, and then through that you can get through it to something better. We have been, in a sense, fortunate that we have not had any, there's been no use of nuclear weapons. There have been no major nuclear weapon accidents recently. So there's been nothing to bring these issues to the fore in the news. On the one hand, that's good. On the other hand, it's led to very, very little public appreciation of the fact that the weapons are still there, and the situation is now at least as dangerous as it was 50 years ago when there was a lot of attention paid to these questions. The interstate highways were built in part to deal with evacuation from nuclear attack. The threat that we're living under there is still there, and yet it doesn't affect our day-to-day decision-making the way it used to.
Can I just add on that? And I also, having spent a significant portion of my career in government, understand the pragmatic approach on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's not that morality and ethics are irrelevant to the nuclear planning process. And in particular, I'm thinking about international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict, and how that in fact binds and regulates the nuclear planning that happens within the military. And in fact, there is a legal review process within the military of nuclear attack options to evaluate whether they meet the criteria of the law of armed conflict, and to ensure that the principles of discrimination, that is not purposely targeting non-combatants or civilians, and proportionality are observed. And all that having been said, I would also say, but even those laws are not static. Law evolves over time and reflects the evolution of the culture and society in which those laws exist. And we've seen our legal basis for thinking about nuclear law, nuclear use, evolve over time. And this is why, for me, it's so important that the Catholic Church has taken the position that it has on the morality or immorality of use of nuclear weapons. And it's why I think it's so important that this dialogue needs to be pushed out at the parish level, because that's how, over time, we will affect the understanding around nuclear weapons and what's moral or immoral about them. That's how we can affect a broader dialogue that will help us evolve the legal framework over time. It starts with culture. It starts with how we as a society understand and set boundaries around these systems.
Yeah, Archbishop, I would be interested in your kind of response to that. I mean, do you see what the Catholic Church is doing now in terms of putting an emphasis on reinforcing the taboo as a first step towards starting to kind of alter and shift that international law framework? And what are some of the responses that you've seen from states, particularly states that either possess nuclear weapons or are under the U.S. extended deterrent to the Pope's vision?
I don't know if I understand your question correctly, but the steps that are being taken is one that was referred the education process. I think there is a difference in the public perception of what a few years ago the talk, the writing about the humanitarian and ecological consequences of using the bomb would have been. And now you don't see that reflected anymore even in debates that are intellectually more sophisticated. So that's one problem that we are trying to overcome. And the journey that we have to take together is exactly to bring people to support the decision process, because the change will come through political decision. But the political decision will not come about unless there is the support.
And when you start to engage with states on these questions, do you feel like you're able to begin having those conversations that push them to take the Pope's teaching into account?
If we look around the globe, how leaders are talking about these issues, we see that the voice of the Pope is kind of exceptional. It's not, I don't hear the President Putin or President Trump talk about these issues in a constructive way.
Certainly agree with it. Most of their comments, well, really all of their comments on this have not been constructive. I have a number of additional questions I'd like to ask, but I do want to make sure we have time for audience Q&A. So I'm going to ask that you please introduce yourself, that you ask a question, that you try to be concise so that we can get through everyone's questions, because we only have a short amount of time. So yeah, we'll start here in the front.
Thank you. First, I like to always start where I am. We're at Georgetown University, and Georgetown University, to its credit, has a socially responsible investment policy. The first value with which it decides to align itself is the university will use reasonable efforts to avoid investments in companies that are substantially involved in the provision of abortion services, or that have demonstrated records of widespread violations of human dignity. And then the only tangible reinvestment they've done is taking investments out of coal and fossil fuel, largely because of pressure from students. I think that if the first statement said that it would align itself with investments that impair human dignity, it should include weapons of indiscriminate effect, exactly like the Norwegian pension fund, that would include landmines, cluster munitions, and nuclear weapons because of their inherent immorality and illegality in violating international humanitarian law. Now, if Georgetown set that as an example, that would create traction and debate in many universities on the issue. And to substantiate it, one could point to the success of the Norwegian pension fund, which includes human rights, environmental responsibility, and weapons of mass destruction. So what I would urge students particularly to look at what Norway has done and put pressure on this university. Now, if the Holy See in Rome took a position on responsible investment that called for the divestment of enterprises that support weapons of mass destruction, weapons of indiscriminate effect, that would create debate. Because right now in the United States, many politicians get elected on that first issue on abortion and neglect the rest of the Holy Father's teaching on environment and on nuclear weapons. So I'm looking to create traction and debate at a parish level and at a university level. So if you could respond to that and how investment initiatives create traction, I think that would be very powerful.
Well, I know as part of the movement in support of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, there is a very active divestment campaign. And there actually is a group here in the United States that is starting to ensure that these types of investments, the services to universities, to other large corporations, are not vested in any of the nuclear weapons enterprise. So I certainly agree that that is a good place to start. I think there is a growing movement. But Archbishop, would you like to say anything about whether you see this question of divestment as something that the church might be engaged in?
Money is very important. And the way money is allocated or invested creates a difference. I think there is an increasing awareness that companies, big companies, sometimes have budgets, that especially international companies that are bigger than some states, need to take into account the common good and the long-range good of people, not just the immediate profit. And I think, and I know that, for example, Pope Francis is insisting on a new type of capitalism, a capitalism with conscience, to emphasize exactly the point that Mr. Granoff was referring to, that we need to use what is valued as important, like money, in the direction of transforming the mechanism of society.
And before I get to the next question, I would just note that it's the Green Century Fund and the Zevin Asset Management are the ones that are leading the way on this in the United States, if others are interested. Yes.
Hi, I'm Larry Korb. I work at the Center for American Progress, and I happen to work. Oh, there you go. Hi, I'm Larry Korb. One issue that's come up today is that Adam Smith is trying to get a no first use policy. He's looked for a number of organizations to support it. Is this something that the parish priest might mention on Sunday or something to get your legislator to support that?
Well, I know a number of organizations in Washington have come out in favor of the no first use bill, including our own, in part as part of this idea of rethinking the necessity of deterrence and arguing that there is no circumstance under which nuclear weapons should be used first in a conflict. But do you see sort of the no first use campaign as being part of a step towards the Holy Father's vision?
If we look around the world, there are bishops' conferences, like in Germany, in Japan, France, in a more cautious way, Austria, that are clearly supporting the move of Pope Francis. The United States have also talked about the problem of atomic weapons. not all the bishops agree on the same approach, and that's probably a delicate, complicated factor, a variable that weaken the overall stand. But yes, there is an increasing convergence from not just from the top, but from the bottom to move in the same direction.
Joan or Jim, do you have anything you'd like to add on this priority?
Just briefly, I would say, I think at the parish level to begin having conversations about how to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons and delegitimize nuclear weapons would be very valuable. And I see no first use discussion as being an important part of that kind of parish level discussion. So I do see opportunity there.
And I would just note, too, from the NTI polling, they also polled on the question of increasing decision time, which, of course, is not the same as no first use. But I think it's a related conversation about how to ensure that there's adequate time for sound decision making. Yes, here in the front.
My name is Peter Metz. I'm from Boston, the Archdiocese of Boston. I'm here in Washington. I'm at this conference by accident. Fortunate, very fortunate accident. I came earlier this week to attend the annual gathering, the social ministry gathering sponsored by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. We had the unique pleasure, because nuclear disarmament has been an issue that I chose to work on 3 years ago so that I could devote myself to one of the three great threats in society, and two of which I agree are existential. And the nuclear threat, it might be instantly existential. We need all the awareness you're talking about. Anyway, I had the great pleasure of being one of 600 laymen at the Catholic Social Ministry Gathering, who at the end of the conference, like we always do, went up to Capitol Hill. And the great pleasure I had this year was we were carrying a message from the bishops to renew the New START agreement, to extend it. That's the first time the bishops have agreed that we should carry a message on nuclear disarmament. So it's a very, very good start, okay? But I also have to tell you that I'm an engineer. I'm a Catholic, and I want to thank the Archbishop for reminding me that it's Jesus who first spoke against nuclear weapons. I'd never thought of it that way. When you said that Jesus said, "Those who live by the sword will die by the sword," I can't think of any more pertinent statement about nuclear weapons to arouse the Catholic population. It's going to be tough. We need to arouse the people. I had the great pleasure of being at the 14th annual gathering of the Nobel Peace Laureates, and in that, Willem de Klerk, who won his Nobel Prize with Nelson Mandela for ending apartheid, but is also known as the one who led South Africa to give up its nuclear weapons program. And so in the nuclear disarmament program session of that session, he said at the end, amidst much frustration, we must arouse the people. So I think the call you're making for arousing the people is absolutely right on. And I'm looking forward tomorrow to talking some more about how we might do that. So my question to the Archbishop, finally, thank you. Archbishop, you said that the Holy Father is willing to offer the offices of the Holy See to start creating an environment where people can get together, negotiate. I'm not quite sure what you meant. I'd like you to elaborate on it, please.
the role of the papacy is to teach, to communicate, to offer mediation when necessary. This has been done in practical cases in history. And as I mentioned, the Holy See can offer a neutral ground for people to talk about this compromise that is necessary in order to advance the destruction of the existing bombs and stopping creating, investing for new weapons of mass destruction. But the modalities are going to be worked out. This is something that is beyond my knowledge because the concrete events will determine the modalities of how this contribution can be made.
Unfortunately, I've been told we're out of time for questions. There is a reception, so hopefully there will be time to engage with our panelists a bit more on the questions you didn't have answered, or you didn't get answered. But thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your interest and your attention, and please join me in thanking our speakers.